Thank you, Lynn, very much for reading. We're continuing our series in Daniel with another absolutely great story. Look at verse 19 to get absolute dictatorship described. Whom he would, he killed, or kept alive, or raised up, or humbled. That is what absolute power has always meant. Anyone else watch on YouTube this week? Kim Jong-un's generals wading into freezing water, waving at their leader. That's because he has that power, that same power. But then in verse 6, that king, his colour changed, his thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. Inside a capital city under siege, the paranoid dictator is no longer enjoying his party. So it's a very, very vivid scene. The chapter opens really well for him, a new king, and he is inside the impenetrable walls of Babylon, capital of the global superpower. He is America, rather than North Korea in the comparison, and he calls together 1,000 lords for a drinking game. But the chapter is driven by his fear. In front of his lords, his wives, his concubines, and all his wise men, he loses all control of his own body. Belshazzar is unraveled by fear and brought into conversation with a man who should be terrified of him, but is not. Conversation with Daniel, one Jewish man in conversation with absolute power. We're over 20 years now from chapter 4, where we were last week. There has been regime change, a coup d'etat, and Daniel is now an old man, not even remembered by the civil service that he used to run. Paranoid dictator with the army and the lords against a tired old exile who should be terrified, but is not. And this week, Daniel shows us life when the powerful set themselves against God. And he shows us why it is the powerful who should fear and the believers who should be confident. So inside the notice sheet, there's some points. The first heading is, taking on God is for idiots. Maybe it's paranoia with the enemy camped outside the walls. Maybe it's overconfidence. Maybe it is calculated political propaganda. But Belshazzar goes all out for a great feast with 1,000 lords where maybe there was food. We're not really told about that. We're told about the wine. Belshazzar drank wine in front of them. He drank it, he tasted it, and he casts around for a way to demonstrate his power. And he remembers there was a God who a previous king, Nebuchadnezzar, made a huge fuss of. He issued proclamations like chapter 4, calling that God Most High and the King of Heaven, said he ruled over all the earth. So, since we're feeling powerful, let's take on that God. And the narrative uses repetition to slow things down frame by frame as the drunk king calls for the vessels of gold and silver, the ones that my predecessor took from the temple in Jerusalem. And they bring them out so that everyone can drink from them. But that probably takes a while. They have to find the right key and the right chest and move a load of other gold and silver stuff and polish them up and bring them out. The ones that had been, verse 3, in the temple, the house of God. Are you sure this is a good idea? In Jerusalem. And they drank from them. And it seems pretty clear this is a deliberate act of sacrilege, something that the all-powerful conqueror Nebuchadnezzar never dared to do. But while they've been polishing it up, the king's ideas have been developing. They drank the wine, all right, but then, verse 4, they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Belshazzar will demonstrate his power by taking on the Most High King of Heaven. And that is a move that is pretty familiar from the history books. At the French Revolution, they banned religion. They banned crosses and bells. They enforced the worship of the goddess Reason in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and they even brought in a 10-day week with no Sundays. Then Soviet Russia, they aimed to eliminate religion entirely. Here's how they did it. They allowed worship in private and in religious spaces, but they banned religious displays in public. And they used propaganda, the media, and the school syllabus to teach that science had disproved all religious superstition. It's also a move familiar to anyone who's done any youth work. Ouija boards are not just teenagers engaged in open-minded religious exploration. Black Sabbath, the band, could not just as easily have been called Purple Tuesdays. And there is a reason the two scary shops opposite my bus stop have windows full of Christian symbols, just printed upside down on T-shirts. Because if you can take on this God, then you can really show your independence and your power, your total autonomy from any power and control, from the supreme ruler of the universe and from the mother who wants you to change your socks. And normally, the God of heaven ignores the teenage toy Satanist. And normally, he allows the dictator to run his course as well. But on this night, in 539 BC, God sends a message. Verse 5, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote in the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Belshazzar gets the full supernatural treatment. When teenagers do with the Ouija board, it just needs, a vase to fall over and they're screaming for their mum. Belshazzar gets a disembodied hand, writing clearly visible in the best lit section of the room, writing on the wall in letters that remain long after everybody is hoping this was just a drunken mistake. And Belshazzar goes from taking God on to total desperation. Verse 6, his face, his thoughts, his legs, and his shakes. The great and powerful king, and he has just one urgent and desperate need. He needs to know what the writing means. So from his quivering heap on the floor, he yells out for the specialists, his enchanters and Chaldeans and astrologers. He has an ancient court full of specialists. They're offered money and the highest available rank in the kingdom, and they all file in, and they do as much good for him as they did for Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 and in chapter 4. They could not read the writing. And at that point, Belshazzar really loses it. If you thought he was bad when he was alarmed before, his colour changes again. He's like a cartoon chief in Asterix. And the man who fell over and shook when he was alarmed, he is now greatly alarmed. And his lords are perplexed. And if that makes you think of English civil servants doing the cryptic crossword in an armchair, then think again. You have 1,000 drunken Oriental aristocrats, each one with a palace floozy on his knee, and they're all shouting at each other in panic until the Queen Mother hears them. The Queen Mother hears them, and she totters in on her Zimmer frame to deliver the antidote to colour-changing kings. She is old enough to remember that somewhere in the palace, thrown away, is an old man with understanding like the wisdom of the gods, to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. Your predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, made him chief of all the magi. And the queen is wiser than the experts who can't even admit they need help from the old exile they replaced. And we don't know her name. People speculate maybe she is Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, who the usurpers have married into the old king's line to secure the throne. But she still is full of memories from the old days. See, Belshazzar has come a long way in 7 verses, all-powerful, taking on gods, to shivering on the floor and needing his mum. See, taking on the God of Jerusalem seemed like such a good idea. But now, Belshazzar knows 2 things for certain. He knows first that God is real. Real as in powerful, even here in his banqueting hall 500 miles from Jerusalem. And the second thing he knows is that God is interested in him. Disembodied fingers have written him a message. God is real, and God is interested in him, but he doesn't have a clue what God is saying. So he panics. And we can laugh at him, but actually I think that is where Belshazzar of Babylon has the edge on much complacent confusion about God in the 21st century. So he knows what he knows. God is real and interested. He knows what he doesn't know. I haven't got a clue what God thinks of me. So he panics. And that, I think, is a good reaction. It's interesting, isn't it, that both atheists and the kind of cuddly, confused Christianity that many atheists grew up with, they essentially say the same thing about God. Isn't that surprising? So even if God exists, they say, you don't need to worry about him. So the atheist buses a few years ago said, there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. And at one level, that makes a kind of bit of sense. You don't need to worry about God if he's not there. There might be all sorts of other things in your life that you need to worry more about if there's no God, but that makes some kind of sense. But the Christian equivalent goes like this. It goes, well, I like to think there is a God, and what I know about him is he wants you to stop worrying and enjoy your life. But if God is real and interested and communicating, as Belshazzar discovered, then we really need to know what he is saying. We need to know that that is what he wants, for us not to worry and enjoy our lives. And if we're not clear, we should be as terrified as Belshazzar, rather than as complacent as 21st century London. I'm sorry if you've never been told that God is real and interested in you and has spoken words that concern you. Many, many apologies if you've been told by people in my job with dog collars and in pulpits that God is vague and distant and into hugs and comforting. The real God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ is definite and present and into love and justice, which is an entirely different proposition. And taking him on is for idiots. So they find Daniel, and Daniel is offered the royal bribe, but Daniel could not care less. Verse 17, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Faced with supreme royal power, Daniel should be terrified, but is not, because Daniel is an old man, and he has tested the truth of God over 7 decades of turbulent geopolitics, because he has learned over a lifetime the truth that is still wet in writing on Belshazzar's wall. So Daniel says, I will read the interpretation. And the interpretation is that taking on God is for idiots because, point 2, even kings have kings. See, what Daniel does here is interesting. He keeps the king waiting. Keeps the king waiting for what the writing means and gives him a divine history lesson instead. And the point of the history lesson is to teach Belshazzar what it is like to be God. So what Daniel does is he begins talking about, like any old man, begins talking about the days when he was young, his days at court and the days of King Nebuchadnezzar. There's a diagram on your sheet, and it shows you how the relationship works between a king like Nebuchadnezzar and everybody else on the planet. So verse 18, Nebuchadnezzar given kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. Verse 19, and where the diagram says people, you may put in brackets all peoples, nations and languages, which isn't really flattery. That is just factual observation. Nebuchadnezzar had personally conquered several very great multilingual, multinational empires, most famously Assyria and Egypt. The gold and silver vessels in Jerusalem, I said they'd probably be hard to find, because what Nebuchadnezzar did was get the treasure from every kingdom within his reach. People who'd spent hundreds of years stealing as much gold as they possibly could from everywhere, Nebuchadnezzar had it all. And the arrows on your diagram, they represent the relationship between king and people. That's in verse 19. What flows up from people to king is, well, they trembled and feared before him. And what flows down well, whom he would, he killed, or kept alive, or raised up, or humbled. And that is how it always is with absolute power. I remember when I was 18 realising I would never have genuine executive power again. When I was 18, I had a school jacket. It had two different sorts of bits of paper in it. On this side, we had blue chits. If I gave you a blue chit with your name on it, you had to get up at 8 in the morning and go and see the deputy head. That was pretty good. If I gave you a pink chit with your name on it, you had to get up at 8:15 to meet the deputy head, who was angry by then from meeting all the blue chit people, and you had to go for a run in the freezing cold. So all I needed was blue chit, pink chit, and a supply of pens, and I had total, absolute power. Well, if tiny power can go to the head of 18-year-olds, imagine absolute, world-striding power in the head of a king like Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar. You've got your third in the kingdom chits and your slave for life chits. You've got your off with your heads or your mercy and life. And obviously, the right response from his people is trembling and fear. That is the most basic political survival course. That was every normal day of King Belshazzar's life. The people, they are for the trembling and the fearing. But so far, we've only talked about two of the elements in our diagram. That's too limited. That is too zoomed in. Because verse 18 said that the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar his greatness, which is why we have the layer above. Even kings have a king. All of their power comes from God, even if they got it by conquest like Nebuchadnezzar or by palace coup like Belshazzar, which means there are arrows of relationship between God and the king, just as surely as there are between the king and the people. And if Belshazzar knows all about his relationship with the people, he shouldn't be so slow to understand his relationship with God. And in the history lesson, the point is made as Daniel the prophet basically preaches a sermon on Daniel chapter 4. Your predecessor Nebuchadnezzar, what did he send up in the up arrow to God? Well, verse 20, heart lifted up, spirit hardened, dealt proudly. What he doesn't need to say is, how would you deal with a subject like that, King Belshazzar? What would you do to them? Verse 21 gives us political history from 20 years ago. It's the madness of King George, the regression of King Nebuchadnezzar to living like an animal until he realized the world is set up as we have it in the diagram. The Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. At which point, God responds to him far more generously than your normal human monarch, and restores Nebuchadnezzar to his throne. Verse 22. And you, his son Belshazzar. How have the arrows been going in your relationship with God? Have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Not humble, but actually, verse 23, you lifted up against the Lord of heaven. Even Nebuchadnezzar was only proud. He didn't try and fight God and take him on. You thought your gods would protect you, when actually they do not see or hear or know, and do not stand a chance against the Lord of heaven. See, your arrows going up have been all hostility and pride and asking for a fight. But he is the God, end of verse 23, in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways. Now, I love the fact that still Daniel hasn't told him what the writing means. So the writing is why he's a gibbering wreck. Daniel hasn't told him. All he's done is a very, very basic lesson in the difference between even the most important human being and the God who created the universe. That's all he's done. Because really, Belshazzar knows what the writing is going to say. That's why he fell shaking to the floor. Even if he's deluded most of his brain into thinking he is autonomous and supreme and the ruler of everything, there is a part of his soul caged up at the back and hammering on the door to be let out before the rest of the body does some real damage, saying, well, you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. And again, I think we can have more sympathy with Belshazzar of Babylon than with much of our complacently, casually rebellious culture. You see, he actually ruled the world. He actually ruled the world. I can understand why he became confused and thought there was no higher power over him. Certainly it makes more sense for him than for somebody who rules the derivatives desk or the classroom or a political party. He had a palace and enough wives and concubines to feast 1,000 lords, and a treasure room so full it's hard to find stuff. I can understand why he became confused and thought that he had everything that he needed and that no one could take it away from him. Certainly it makes more sense for him than for somebody with 2 cars or 4 bedrooms or private health insurance. See, if he took on God more dramatically, using God's own cups to praise the gods he'd made up, well, a lot of that is just an accident of circumstance and opportunity. Because what our culture does is take these lives that God has given us and these body God has made and the breath that God gives us, and we decide to lift our hearts up and harden our spirits and deal proudly. Our culture, including me so very often, is about I will do what I want, what seems best to me, as if God had never existed, had never sent his son, had never spoken. And the actual verdict on Belshazzar doesn't take long for Daniel to tell. God wrote the name of 4 coins on the wall. Did you know that? So mene, tekel, parsin. Verse 25 is roughly a pound, tuppence and 50p, which is to reduce Belshazzar's life to check stubs and bank statements. But there's more to it than that, because God gives Daniel an interpretation with each one, because each unit of currency has a verb that sounds just like it. So mene sounds like numbered. Verse 26. And God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel sounds like weighed. Verse 27. And God has weighed you on the scales and found you wanting. Parsin sounds like divided. Verse 28, which is exactly what God is going to do to your kingdom. Your final humiliation is that you'll be succeeded by coalition government, the Medes and the Persians. And I think it is no accident that these are the very things that autonomous humanity most hates about God and the idea of God. Do you know the author Philip Pullman, who wrote a series of novels for children? He says his aim is to find a way of believing that we are not subservient creatures dependent on the whim of some celestial monarch, but free citizens of the Republic of Heaven. And if you've read the novels, you know one of the key moments is when the children effectively euthanize God, put him out of his misery, so that everybody can be free. There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. But Belshazzar learned that there certainly is a God, and a God who meets our claims to autonomy with the absolute authority to number our days. How can you take on a God who gets to choose how many days you'll live for, if your breath is in the palm of his hand? A God who has the moral authority to weigh us, not because he wants to prevent the enjoyment of life, but because he cares how we live and is interested in us and in all the other people we bump into and affect, and who sees our selfishness often and greed and anger and the consequences it has all over the world, and weighs us. And he meets the God who can take all our achievements and divide them, pull them down, and give them to other people. And by the end of the chapter, Belshazzar is simply in shock, I think. He gives the command in verse 29 on autopilot, and Daniel in his 70s stands there dignified as these servants dress him in robes that he knows are utterly meaningless. The king says, "You can be third ruler in my kingdom." But Daniel knows that that is power he will hold for minutes rather than hours or days, because, verse 30, that very night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom. Let me finish with two applications. That's point 3. Two applications. So kings be humble and believers be confident. See, this chapter has two audiences. Chapters 2 to 7, we've said of Daniel, they're written not in the language that Daniel learned at home in Jerusalem as a child, not in the language of the prophecies he hung on to or the psalms he prayed, but they're written in the language he learned to administer an empire and advise a king. They're written in Aramaic, and so uniquely in the Bible they stand out as words addressed to the world that has power over believers rather than the believers themselves. So this is a direct address to powerful people who want to oppress the people of God. Poor old Belshazzar doesn't really get time to get going, but some of the others do with their fiery furnaces and pits full of lions. And the later chapters, when we get to them, will predict a future full of powerful empires who will mistreat the people of God. What does God say to them in their power and their bald-faced taking on of God? Well, we've said most of this already. God says even kings have a king. And it doesn't make any difference whether you believe in him or not, or whether you call yourself the Council of Deputies, or the Supreme Soviet, or the local council of an English market town. Just as surely as you exercise your authority over those below you, Daniel 5 says God exercises greater authority over you. Greater and utterly real. And once you know all this, and Belshazzar did, then the lesson is to copy his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar and humble yourself. Recognize all authority comes from God, including yours, and can be redistributed by him whenever he chooses. And that ultimately, at the point of death, it is God's weighing that matters more than human achievement. And the events of 539 BC, they're just one more piece of evidence that God can do this. Don't you, if you know that Daniel 5 was one of those chapters that used to be treated as a classic case of the Bible getting its history wrong. Do you know why they said that? They said that because we had never heard of a king called Belshazzar. We'd never found a record of him. Actually, worse than that, we knew for certain who was king of Babylon on the day the Persians took it. And his name was Nabonidus, not Belshazzar. So people said, well, there you go. God doesn't control history. He has to make it up to fool the gullible. This is all lies. Which is a nice reminder of how incomplete our knowledge of the past is and how cautious we should be to make snap judgments. Because in 1881, somebody found something called the Nabonidus cylinder. They found it 60 kilometers north of Babylon. It's now in Berlin. There's a copy in the British Museum down the road. It's written by King Nabonidus, and he talks about his son, Belshazzar. And what we now know is that Nabonidus basically was quite a lazy king, and after 3 years he retired, really. He went to live by an oasis, and he allowed his son Belshazzar to be his co-king. They ruled together. And they ruled together, in fact, right up until the point where it was clear the Persians were a real problem, when Nabonidus came out of retirement, and he commanded the army quite a long way from the capital city against Cyrus the Persian, which meant that when Cyrus the Persian sent a little detachment of troops to try and capture the capital city, Babylon, by surprise, who was left in charge that night? King Belshazzar, his son, his co-ruler. Which makes very, very good sense of the text. Did you notice the way Belshazzar kept offering to make people the third highest ruler in the kingdom? He can't make them second highest ruler in the kingdom, because that's his job. There's daddy and him, and then there's the job he's offering. And suddenly this Bible account fits very, very well with the history that we now know of the time. And we have different accounts of quite how the city fell. Some people say the city opened their gates. They were delighted to see the Persians because they didn't like Belshazzar. Herodotus says that the Persians diverted the Euphrates, which allowed them to wade into the city through the sewers. Now, if that's true, then even as Daniel is telling the king that he can keep his gifts, the river level is dropping, bit by bit by bit, as Daniel's about to begin his sermon. And even as Daniel is explaining that your days are numbered and your kingdom is to be given to the Medes and the Persians, there are Medes and Persians waist deep in the stink, in the sewers underneath them, well inside the impenetrable walls, and about to bring down the strongest empire in the world. Belshazzar and all rulers need to humble themselves before they meet their maker in judgment. And the good news, actually, with Daniel 4 in front of him, is that the God who gives second chances gave one even to somebody like Nebuchadnezzar, would give one to any dictator or ruler, and certainly to anybody here. But we also just need to hear what this passage says to the second audience, to believers. And I guess our situation only occasionally looks like Daniel's situation, but the truths that gave backbone to that 70-year-old old man then can give backbone to us in similar but less frightening situations. So why isn't Daniel scared? There are lots and lots of reasons why he should be. The king only has to say one word and he is dead. And the government of Belshazzar, can you think of a more frightening power? That night, it was a particular fever pitch of arrogance and defiance of God and intoxication and paranoia and guilt. But more than that, just the normal scary thing of a dictator, more than that, reading between the lines, you get a sense for Daniel's position and the huge sense of disappointment he must have felt. See, he's no longer one of the wise men, but when we last heard, he was their boss. He's not remembered by anybody but the old queen, even when they're very worried. And they have to go and find him from wherever they've buried him, right out of the way. And again, from sources outside the Bible, we can confirm what Daniel's first audience would have known. We are 20 years now from the death of Nebuchadnezzar. We are 15 years from the palace coup that brought Nabonidus and his son and co-ruler Belshazzar to power. And it doesn't take much imagination, does it, to think of the effect that would have had on Daniel, running the government under King Nebuchadnezzar. But more than that, Daniel believes God's promises to his people. And Daniel goes on believing those promises after Jerusalem is conquered, even repeatedly, even after people like him are carried 500 miles away and put down to live among their enemies. He goes on believing those promises when Jerusalem is burnt down and the temple is destroyed. He believes that God is going to do something amazing, that God promised to rebuild Jerusalem and send them all home. And then Daniel has 45 years of seeing God act powerfully, sees God changing the heart of the evil dictator, the ruler of the superpower, who would need to make that decision to send them home. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't begin that well, but he seems to be really responding to treatment and humbling himself and issuing proclamations about the God of Jerusalem. And he's made Daniel his prime minister. Surely it's just a very short step from there to the promises coming true. But the point of Daniel chapter 5 is that Belshazzar is nothing like Nebuchadnezzar. He deliberately takes on God. He hates God. Daniel has been sacked and retired and everything has come apart. And the amount of time that God said, the number of years God said it would take to fulfill the promises is nearly over. We've got 1 or 2 years left on the clock. There is no human way to spot a good outcome from here. What seems so close 20 years ago is now all falling apart. And again, throughout history, there have been plenty of moments when Christians thought they could guess where God was just about to do great things. So in the 1850s, do you know, In the 1850s, half of the population of England went to church. That must have seemed like it. All these revivals, and we've got half the nation. Surely now we'll be able to go on to great things. Or again, actually, in the 1950s, after 2 world wars, people were looking for meaning, and people began coming back to church. Billy Graham packed out Wembley Stadium repeatedly for ages with people from London come to hear the gospel. Or maybe we think that something in our day is the thing that God is going to use, maybe church planting or evangelistic courses. Well, maybe. God is very powerful. God can do whatever he wants. But Daniel is also here to prepare us for times when everything seems to be getting harder, when it seems there is no human way for a good outcome. And it's particularly hard, isn't it, to trust when you're disappointed, when you thought things seemed to be getting so close and now they've all gone wrong. But Daniel clearly has not stopped trusting. And we don't know what his spiritual life was like in between, but every time this man is summoned into the life or death audience chamber, he shows he really believes that kings have a king, and that the King of Heaven has made promises to Daniel that he is going to keep. And we can learn from Daniel's example, but more than that, we can learn from his history. See, that night, the king Belshazzar, the king opposed to God, is killed. And the kingdom is received by a 62-year-old man called Darius, who we'll see is, basically he has Belshazzar's job in Cyrus's rule. He's the sort of Median deputy to the Persian king Cyrus. So that night, the people of God fall under the rule of Cyrus the Great of Persia, who is quoted twice in the Bible. Did you know that? In 2 Chronicles 36 and in Ezra chapter 1. In the first year of his rule, so within 365 days of these events, Cyrus says this: "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth." He's been listening to Daniel chapter 5. "And he, the Lord, has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord your God be with him. Let him go up." Who would have thought the promise of God would come true exactly on time, only months after the whole world was being ruled by an absolute dictator who hated God? Who would have thought it? Only someone who believes a promise from God is a promise from the King over all kings. Let's pray. Dear Father God, we praise you that you are a king over all kings, that you hold our breath in your hands, and all of our life, the days of our life, are numbered by you. Father, please humble us where we act in rebellion to you. Please make us bow in fear and humility before you. But then, Father, also please make us trust you boldly, confidently, no matter what the world throws, because we know you are the king over all kings, and your promises are true and sure. And we pray this with thanks in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.